All right, welcome back for our third installment of the 2021 Rude Rock webinar series. And as always, I just wanted to mention I sincerely appreciate all of you tuning into these. And our first two webinars for this year have gotten some pretty good views and feedback. So hopefully we can continue that momentum on today. For today, we're going to get into the X's and O's from the hips to the toes. And really, this is just going to be a look at a blueprint or a theoretical model for optimizing lower body training. And one of the particular differences on this for me is going to be really just the perspective of the population that I work with. So as most of you are aware by now, my work revolves pretty steadily around overcoming and improving injured areas. And of course, that includes, pretty much any lower body injury under the sun at this point. But where most strength coaches, especially at the high school and the collegiate level, are chasing peaks, whether it be peak strength or speed, power, whatever it may be, really my work is more rooted in pursuing equilibrium or getting athletes back to an appropriate foundation for them to continue up and onward. So I think this comes with a few different things, but predominantly it really is just a shift in perspective or paradigm on not just the cut and dry anatomy and biomechanics, but also how the independent parts or the collective pieces of our anatomy coalesce together and create global or gross movement. So indirectly over the years, this has really afforded me a keen understanding of these muscular and orthopedic and fascial relationships. And I think that one thing that gets overlooked a little bit with the lower leg and the foot is the decrements that come with lower body injuries for virtually anything in the training realm. So it's not just like having a foot injury is going to affect lower leg or foot actions. It's really going to have some kind of an impact on just about anything. So emphasizing and understanding the relationships is really the key to optimizing the lower body, in my opinion. And, we'll talk obviously about this as we go throughout, but we have to be able to understand the importance of individuality and how different setups, different stances, positions, or even load applications can create different outcomes for athletes. Collectively speaking, as we go through this today, you're going to hear me emphasize a few different things quite a bit, and among those are going to be, identifying the appropriate relationships for lower body mechanics. So whether we're looking at hip mobility versus knee stability or foot stability, or if we're looking at it from more of a muscular lens and we're looking at the ratio between quad strength and hamstring strength on the ipsilateral leg, appropriate ratios is going to be a grand theme for us today. In addition to that, and this is definitely something you're going to hear me say quite a bit, closing the gaps between strengths and weaknesses is something that I've latched on to, and I've just continued to find success with it. So that will definitely be something we'll get into today. And then lastly, we'll talk a lot about kinetic integration and or muscular sequencing. And this is something that may not apply quite as much with the athletic population, but for me and for those who work in the tactical realm, as you know, the kinetic integration and muscular sequencing is something that is generally not performed very well. So as we go through this today, I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind that every cost has a benefit, but it also has an expense. So really our job as a strength and conditioning coach becomes looking for ways that we can not just make the right investments, but we want to try to optimize the return on our expense. So we know that every adaptation is going to come with a positive and a negative adaptation. So it isn't just about driving the positive adaptation, but it's also minimizing the expense of that adaptation. So starting out here just with some of my general perspective on the lower body, and if we look here to the left of the screen in the gold text here, we'll start out with the foot, and I perceive the foot to be the origin of movement. And really, it's kind of baffling to me to see so much pushback on training the foot, the lower leg, and the ankle, because if you look at injury rates of just about any professional sport, almost every sport is going to predominantly have lower body injuries. So in a very direct and literal sense, the foot, ankle, calf, Achilles complex is fundamental to sport. Now, one thing real quick with the foot being the origin of movement that I believe is overlooked is the sensory effects or impacts of the foot. So it isn't just the literal contact point between the human body and the environment around it, but it is also constantly sensing and collecting information about the environment and transmitting it directly to the brain for us to prepare and organize movement accordingly. If we look to the hip, I perceive the hip to be the epicenter of movement. And this is, again, another one that is a little bit difficult for me to understand why we have so much pushback on hip work. Because if we look above and below the joint itself, it literally is the junction of kinetic integration from the lower and up to upper extremities. So for the hips, we need to understand that there is going to be a quintessential aspect to hip mechanics for any sport, irrespective of what it is they do or age of development, where if we don't have proficient hip function, then everything above and below it will be compromised in some way or form. As for the knee, I view the knee as the barometer of force tolerance. I really do see a lot of logic behind the knee being the byproduct of the hip and the foot. And the reason for that is if you look at the hip joint, the ankle joint, and then you look at the foot, each of those three all move in all three planes of motion as, kind of primary actions. Well, the knee isn't designed that way. The knee is obviously, predominantly a uniplanar joint. And when you have a joint that doesn't move in a lot of degrees of freedom, it can be very confounding to find solutions for problems because there's only so many different things you can do. So I look at the foot and the hip to be like drivers of lower body function and movement, while the knee is going to be much more of a passenger. The knee is going to experience an increase or a decrease in force magnitude, torque velocity, all these different things based on the ability of the foot and the hip to do what they're supposed to do. So if we jump back to the foot for a sec, another thing that I really try to emphasize with our foot and ankle is the integrity of structure and stiffness. This is especially the case during dynamic movement or anything that's locomotive in nature. And if we have deformation at the foot, whether it be, excessive midfoot pronation or we have bleeding in the ankle in an elevated heel position, when we lose that mechanical tensioning or stiffness at the foot, it is going to compromise everything up the chain. So this is another one where we need to be adamant about getting the foot in the right position and maintaining integrity throughout movement in order to optimize what we're trying to get out of the athlete. With the hips, I believe that the demand should meet the sport, no more, no less. And when we talk about the hips, it's almost immediately connotated towards becoming what I call a mobility monster. And this is just flagrantly incorrect. Just because superficially mobility looks like it's harmless or it's something that quote unquote everybody should be doing in nature, in a lot of the cases, you're actually going to destabilize the athlete by forcing mobility on them. Mobility has its time and place, of course, but I would say arbitrarily that about 75% of my hip-specific work is actually more strength or stability oriented. So it's just another example of us kind of putting the cart before the horse, where we just see things that become trendy, and then all of a sudden all of our athletes are doing scrupulous amounts of mobility work. So I open this up by saying that relationships were going to be something that we would talk a lot about, and I wanted to kind of start out by taking a look at a general overlay of the lower body relationships. Now, these ratios here on the left side of the page are arbitrary in nature. This isn't anything that's, from a clinical journal or anything like that. So, don't jump down my throat on these. But broadly speaking, I see the hip joint to be about a 2-to-1 mobile to stable joint. Now, the mobility demand is going to be something that's determined by sport. If I have a power forward collegiate basketball player, that's somebody who's going to need a lot more stiffness than mobility in most cases. Whereas if I'm looking at let's just say a point guard, right? So we'll keep it in the same sport, who's going to have a lot more demand of lateral movement and staying low in their defensive stance, mobility may be a little bit more of a factor. But nevertheless, we want to understand that the ratios are going to be governed by sport, context, and ability. It's not just 2-to-1, everybody needs to be twice as mobile as they are stable. At the knee, we're going to have pretty much the inverse of that, where we're going to see about a 3-to-1 stability to mobility demand. Now, the mobility piece for the knee is going to obviously predominantly be in ranges of flexion and extension, but we also have, more micro movements above and below the joint that are going to contribute as well. But broadly speaking, the knee can be perceived as a stable joint. As for the ankle, we're going to flip back over, and it's going to be more of a mobile-based joint. This is another one, though, where you can get carried away with mobility at the ankle and actually start to destabilize the athlete. So just because the predominance is mobility, it doesn't mean that that's all that we're doing in the training room or on the floor. We're just using these relationships to create reference. Down at the foot, this is going to be more of a 1-to-1 mobile versus stable. Now, the stability piece is going to speak more to the collective foot, or all three segments of the foot as a stable pillar or base for us, while the mobility piece is going to speak to more of the interplay between the hind foot, midfoot, and forefoot, and their kind of reciprocating action of mobility as we're going through dynamic actions. Now, if we look over to the right here, just a couple of common examples here. We look at something like hip mobility and foot stability concurrently, and I see this as a primary driver for force production, where we need the hip to be able to move rotationally and in flexion extension optimally with a stable fixed foot in order to produce force effectively. Another one being the stability of the knee and the compliance of the foot. So the stability of the knee, we're thinking about resisting excessive varus valgus patterns and or being pushed too far into flexion when we're trying to create tension or force during a counter movement. But if we don't have appropriate knee stability in conjunction with foot compliance, then we are going to kind of have a loss for our ability to accept force. Foot stability, ankle mobility, so keeping it pretty much at one site here. Now I look towards force dispersion across the foot. So let's use dorsiflexion as the example here. If I can't dorsiflex fully, or we'll say arbitrarily somebody only has, 10 degrees or 15 degrees of closed chain dorsiflexion, the foot stability is going to be almost doubled. The demand is going to be almost doubled because we're not getting into the range of motion that we need to in order for the foot to have an optimal surface to disperse force. So now the stability piece is going to be driven up due to a deficit of ankle mobility. Lastly, for an example here, hip stability and knee mobility, this is going to be more force tolerance, where we want to be able to accommodate for forces not just in a vertical or horizontal fashion, but also that combination or blending of cardinal planes. And if we don't have the ability to stabilize the hip and get the mobility that we need from the knee, then our ability to tolerate force is going to kind of become compromised because we aren't able to get the proper locking mechanism between the quad and the ham and the calf. All of that is to say that mobility and stability should never be perceived as one versus the other, this or that. These can be mutually exclusive traits, and there really isn't an empirical good, bad, right, or wrong because there are so many variables and it's so contextual. But with all of that, if you have a mobile joint, there needs to be a stability component. If you have a predominantly stable joint, there needs to be a mobility component. So you're just looking at the trade-offs from one or the other or of each and trying to find the empirical balance that's best for the athletes that you're working with. So cueing is something that we can have a really lengthy conversation on in and of itself. But to keep it pretty simple here for today, the biggest thing for me with cueing is to provide illustrative language. So in other words, I want to try to portray my meaning as opposed to just stating an instruction. And with athletes who aren't conventional athletes, we'll say the significance of your language is increased 2 or 3-fold. When you have young athletes, again, football, baseball, basketball, that are just constantly running and doing dynamic shit all the time, for them, so much of this is just natural. They're going to naturally find the best way to do things. But again, for my population, especially with the dynamic stuff, is just going to be a little bit more difficult to grasp. So illustrative cueing is big for me. And then again, just kind of knowing the person's background that you're working with so you can find some common ground on language and be able to articulate things in a way in which makes sense for them. We obviously know that there's audible cueing, kinesthetic cueing, and then visual cueing where, we have different types of learning styles, and that should, of course, be taken into consideration. But when we look at the word piece itself, actionable words, dynamic wording, or using things with expression is often an easy way that you can drive home your point. And so if you look here at the chart and see in the gold text, most of these are action words. They are words that stick and have kind of a expressive meaning behind them. In addition to those, we want to make sure that we're not getting too wordy. So we want to keep everything comprehensive, clear, and concise. So the way I'll usually do this is tier it down. I'll take the athlete aside, explain to them in full what I'm trying to get out of the movement or what I'm trying to get out of the sequence that we're doing in full, and then I'll have 2 or 3 operative words. So if we use an example here of, let's say, push with your foot, and we're having somebody on a sled push and they're just not getting into complete extension and they're getting that ankle drop or that bleeding energy pattern at the ankle, I'll explain to them, that in order to achieve full hip extension, I want you to think about pushing the turf away from behind you more so than pushing the sled forward. What this is going to do is give you a nice stiff foot and ankle so that when you go into hip extension, you're getting a full return on that energy investment. But then once I break it down at that point, I'll tear back and it'll just be push the ground away, push the ground away, and just reiterate the one operative point that I want them to latch onto. If we jump to the right side of the page here, a couple of my main cues for the knee, first one that comes to mind is soft knee. And this is one that I would have never thought that I would have to articulate so frequently, but I do. So if we're doing anything in a single leg, the common tendency for athletes, for us, is to kind of lock that knee out in hyperextension. And what they're doing there, if you lock that knee all the way out, is you're actually stabilizing more so through quad contraction as opposed to glute contraction. So you're reinforcing anterior dominance with a population who's already anteriorly dominant. So we want to think soft knee, unlock the knee. This will give you your optimal hamstring length because, as we know, the hamstring crosses the knee joint. But more importantly, what it'll do is it'll give you an opportunity to truly lock the glute in, and now our primary stabilizer is glute dominant as opposed to quad dominant. Attack angle is something that I use for pretty much any split work or any kind of lunging or step-up pattern, where I want you to think about an attack angle being your knee driving forward over your foot, or closed chain dorsiflexion. And this helps to give them a kind of an assimilation of, hey, we are attacking forward, we're moving forward, not just pushing my knee over my toe, but our whole body is kind of coming in behind and driving forward. For the hips, one of everybody's favorites, if we're looking at hinge mechanics, my best cue for this, honest to God, is shit on the wall. Just literally having the athlete trace where their butthole is pointing when they're doing a hip hinge. So shit on the wall is something that is obviously illustrative, to say the least, but also it's something that conceptually does make sense to people. So that's definitely the best way that I've found to cue the hip hinge mechanics. Coiling is something that's a little bit more new for me, but this is something that, I got to give my guy Tim Kelly a ton of credit on, where, we're starting to use this more and more. And coiling is inferring, driving your opposite shoulder into your opposite knee or hip to create mechanical tensioning of the adductor group, the oblique group, and kind of that whole quadrant of the hip and lower abdomen. The coiling factor kind of gives them that internal cue of the rotary aspect of what we're trying to get out of it and creating tension through hip internal rotation. Last one, stacking. This is a much more common cue, but stacking is just a way to get the athlete to establish a neutral pelvis, albeit a bilateral or a single leg variation. But this is something that, we'll also kind of throw the ribs in the mix with as well, where we want to see the canister of the ribs stacked on top of the pelvis, being neutral, stacked over top of the foot and the ankle to give us an empirical center of mass. If we want to talk about the foot, we can segue real quick into a little demo video where I talk Nicole through some of these foot cueings. All right, so when we're looking at force or pressure distribution across the foot, I like to think of the common foundation of being 3 points of contact, and that being the big toe, the ball of the big toe, the ball of the pinky toe, and then the heel. So those three points effectively creating a tripod. So there are three primary ways that I like to cue the foot, and that's going to either be melt, stab, or grab. Obviously, these are going to be contextual based on what we're having the athlete doing, but if we have Nicole demonstrate a melt here, melting is essentially trying to eccentrically splay the foot. You're trying to cover as much surface area as you can, and you're just trying to kind of create a wide foot. So this is going to be a foundational piece for single leg stability, bilateral stance. This is kind of home base. From there we have grab. So this is more of an extrinsic foot action where we're going to actively squeeze and grip the toes down into the ground. And this is going to be a little bit more situational based, but grabbing can be a good cue when you're doing something like a front foot elevated split squat or a step up, and you have a dynamic leg action involved where you want to create contraction throughout the movement. The last one, if we go into a split stance, stab, and stab is cueing specifically the back foot, where I don't want her to just have her leg back behind her passively or just casually. I want her to make sure that she's active with her back leg. So I'll cue this as stabbing the foot back into the ground, and that's going to help drive hip extension or glute activation here. And with this stabbing pattern, this is also something that I'll use to kind of create more of a visual representation of dynamic action. So if we are thinking about coming out of the gate or during an acceleration, or if we're thinking about even just like a dynamic lunge, stabbing into the ground, creating intent with our movement. So lastly, one other cue that I'll use a lot is lifting the foot, or specifically the arch, off the ground. So this is to create a supination bias in the foot, or the outside border of the foot. And this is one that I'll use with athletes who have poor navicular control, or they get that, true midfoot collapse during dynamic action or even in resting posture. But we mentioned our 3 points, our tripod, so ball of the big toe, pinky toe, heel, all driving down. And then I want Nicole to lift her arches off the ground and just try to maintain contact with those 3 points, but at the same time create as much space between the floor and her arch as possible. With this, having this lifting pattern is going to help to activate lower leg lateral compartment muscles. And also too, I think this helps to kind of provide a little more sense of stability for the knee as we kind of pull ourselves out of some vagus patterning or collapsing. So it would take me way too long and way too much of your time to go through every single injury that I've worked with over the years. But it is probably not a stretch to say just about any lower body injury I've seen at least once or twice. But this is really just a short list or a composite list of what I see most. And honestly, this isn't even injury specific. These are more just kind of descriptors. So if we look now at some of the common lower body deficits that I see on a pretty regular basis here, I broke it down to really just these 3 points here, and those being the relationship between the hamstring and the calf, generally poor hip mechanics, and really an absence of any kind of intrinsic or foot strength or stability. And really a major thing for me is to assess these 3 early and often and try to get an idea of where I can make the most impact, because improving even just one of these 3 things with athletes coming off of a lower body injury tends to be quite profound. And starting out at the top here with the calf and the hamstring relationship, this is really just a deficit in mechanical tensioning, or an inability to create lower body stiffness. So the best way to assess or evaluate the calf and the hamstring relationship is through what I refer to as the floating heel technique, or having that front heel suspended in something like a split squat or a step up. And the reason why this is a good litmus test is because having that heel floating is going to force us into active plantar flexion. So if we have active plantar flexion plus any degree of knee flexion or extension, now we're getting co-contraction both above and below the knee joint. So I see this with, a lot of people with non-specific knee pain, athletes who often get cramping in the calf, the arch of the foot, or the hamstring. We could probably even throw the quad in there as well. Or they have compromised positional strength. So maybe bilaterally they're very strong and robust, but then you take them into a split or a single leg stance, and they really aren't worth a shit. That to me is going to speak largely to the relationship between the calf and the hamstring. Also, I'll just generally say here that I think that the lack of attention that we put on the lower leg is baffling to me. The lower leg is extremely significant, and while we're going to obviously get our main work for our thigh or quad and hamstring through all of our big patterns, you absolutely cannot ignore the lower leg. It will come back to bite you. But if we're looking to repair this specifically, these are going to be simple things. We're strengthening the hamstrings, particularly in flexion. We're looking to strengthen the soleus, and then some soft tissue work on the gastroc heads. And then, as I alluded to already, improving the co-contraction of these 2. As for the hip mechanics, again, we don't want to think about hip mechanics as just being a factor or benefactor of mobility, but also our ability to transfer force, our ability to stabilize, and then our ability to demonstrate or achieve multiple planes of motion. So with the hip mechanics, the first thing that we want to look to is improving hip flexor strength. We've been on this wave for years now of people thinking that you just need to, crank and stretch your psoas and your hip flexors out. Well, I would argue that if everybody who treated weak hip flexors with stretching just did basic functional strength movements for the hip flexors, that sensation of tightness, the subsequent or concomitant pain is going to be decreased, and we're going to see a dramatic improvement in overall function. Assessing AB and adduction are going to be critical, and then of course also our internal and external rotation ratios. I am never going to be the coach who's going to have a goniometer out on the floor looking at micro degrees of something like internal external rotation movements, but we can have just a very good subjective feel and idea of where each side is. So looking at both the internal and external ratio of, for instance, the right leg, but then also comparing internal rotation of the right leg versus the left leg. All of these are going to be factors. Depending on what you do and where you're trying to go, determines really the weight of those factors, but those are all going to be important in some capacity. And then on a more global sense, bilateral versus unilateral disparities. This one is much easier to assess and see, and then also kind of clean up after the fact or help to, stratify our programming. As for the intrinsic foot strength, this is something that, we want to think first about force dispersion. So our ability to splay and disperse force across the foot upon ground contact or impact. This is going to literally be the starting point for the force acceptance up the chain, and then again, force production coming out the opposite direction. Generally speaking, I believe that poor intrinsic foot strength is a driver for injury vulnerability. And this is another one where you can show me any research study in the world that may suggest otherwise, and that's fine. I'm not here to bicker about the point, but to me, it is just too intuitive to think otherwise, where if we don't have a stable foundation, we're not going to have a stable house. So we need to make sure that we are checking the minimal boxes on intrinsic strength and stability before we look to add anything robust on top of it. As for general lower body training principles here, breaking these up into each major joint, we'll start out with the foot and the ankle. And what I look to here first is, do we have a compliance or a stiffness limitation? So that's another way of saying, do we have a problem loading or producing force? Our compliance is going to speak more to our ability to load or accept force, where our stiffness is going to speak more to our ability to produce force. From there, proprioception and dexterity are something that I run into a lot. I think that this is something that, again, is wildly overlooked, but the sensory input or proficiency of the foot is going to be a predecessor for a lot of things to come up the chain. Kind of hand in hand with that is creating center of pressure and just having the simple presence of mind or the kinesthetic awareness to be able to understand or perform a lateral bias or a supinated bias or medial pronated bias, forefoot, rear foot bias, but being able to maintain integrity and positional strength depending on where the center of pressure is at the foot. The ratio for plantar flexion and dorsiflexion is something that I've used really to determine what is the more glaring weakness at the foot. So I look at plantar flexion strength versus dorsiflexion range of motion. This is another one where the sports science crowd, I'm probably going to lose you here, but this is not something that I am directly measuring or, getting out a force plate for. I'm just looking at their ability generally to load under plantar flexion and then their ability to get into dorsiflexion, predominantly in a closed chain sense, and then how much disparity is there between the two. As for the hips, probably a little bit more simply stated, do we have a mobility or a stability deficiency? Is this athlete more likely to be injured or have compromised performance because they are too brittle to endure force or because they are too stiff to avoid contact? So the mobility piece is going to be something that, again, is going to be governed by sport. The stability piece is going to be a byproduct of our strength factors. Internal, external rotation, we already talked a little bit about, but what we didn't touch on yet is the difference between active and passive range of motion. I've put quite a few things out on this, but active range of motion is where the athlete is going through the range of motion themselves, and then the passive range of motion is where somebody is taking them through that range of motion. So I look at active range of motion as a motor control and a strength deficit, where passive range of motion is going to be a flexibility or a tissue deficit. So this again speaks to why you can't just become a mobility monster, because if somebody has a poor active range of motion, that's not necessarily a mobility problem. That is probably more of a stability problem or, again, a motor control issue. So we can do all the hip flailing and shin box bullshit all day, but if we never complement it with strength, then we're just giving them access to more ranges of motion that they can't control. It doesn't make any sense. For the knees, impact or range of motion limitation. So, we are looking again to two simple objective traits or abilities, and which one is more glaring. Are they having more trouble achieving deep ranges of flexion because of a range of motion limitation, or are they having more trouble with something like, repetitive impact stress during plyos or running? I think that in either case, it's a knee solution is not just a knee solution. It's going to speak to above and below the joint, but for all intents and purposes, we want to make sure that we have good shear tolerance, or we can manage, rotational forces. But again, the uniplanar joint is not designed for torque. So if we don't have appropriate hip mobility, or we don't have a proficient hip internal rotation to accommodate the torque aspect, or if we have a deficit of foot stability, then that torque then goes to the knee. And when the knee is expected to accommodate torque, we're going to have some issues. So if we take a look at kind of an itemized program checklist, my strength litmus test that I tend to use most is the ability to load single leg. So I look generally at about a 1.5 or 1.5 times body weight measure for single leg strength. My personal go-to is a Hatfield or a safety bar reverse lunge. I think that this is a good one because the safety bar really gives us the best opportunity to purely analyze the lower leg, where if we have a straight bar, we're kind of getting into more of a total body movement and less of just a pure leg movement. But that's a minute point. If you don't have access to a safety bar, I think a straight bar is fine. But nevertheless, being able to load 1.5 times body weight on one leg, I am not personally concerned with any bilateral lower body movement loads. If you can load 2 times your body weight, that's great. It just doesn't really mean much for me personally. Eccentric loading is something that I think for my population is so important because they are such a anterior chain, concentric only type of population that, we want to challenge them eccentrically before we continue to just improve them concentrically. And positional strength is something that probably speaks to a similar sentiment where, they're very strong where they're strong, but then they're very weak when they're weak. So if you have somebody who's strong in low degree hip flexion in a bilateral stance, how much does that really give you for the sake of sport, as opposed to a deep flexion single leg movement? So if we're strong in one, it does not mean we're strong in all. And we can even take that a step further in saying if we're strong on the left leg, it doesn't necessarily mean we're strong on the right leg. So different angles, different patterns, different vectors, and really trying to challenge positional strength. Broadly speaking, the weakest muscular groups that I see or movement groups that I see are going to be the adductors, hip flexors, internal rotators, plantar flexion, and then hamstrings, particularly in flexion. So normally most of my programming for the strength's sake is going to revolve around those. Movement-wise, first and foremost, and by far the most important in my mind, is closing the gap between active and passive ranges of motion. When we have greater passive range of motion than we do active range of motion, in my mind, that is the window of vulnerability. Or in other words, I'm able to move into ranges that I can't control. So we want to make sure that we are managing and minimizing the margin between those two. This seems like a general kind of a cop-out point here, but I look for robustness and durability. I don't need my athletes to be able to do the splits. I don't need my athletes to be able to do a pistol squat. None of that shit really matters. What matters is can they do what they're required to do, and then can they do it at an exceptionally high level for a very long period of time, oftentimes an undefined amount of time, and maintain durability throughout. So for this, it is, again, a shotgun approach where I'm just trying to challenge them in as many different directions or ways as I can because we really don't know what they're going to be required to do. Lateral movement is something that in this population is pretty remiss across the board. They're very, very sagittal base dominant. So just getting them outside of sagittal is really a win for most of my athletes. For the movement piece, we see a lot of fibrotic or just kind of nasty, gristly adductors that don't really move or load well. Again, hip ER/IR is going to be something that's going to be compromised for most. We see pretty poor dorsiflexion, generally speaking, especially closed chain, and then a lot of incomplete hip extension. So those would be kind of my top go-tos for the movement piece. And then finally, dynamically, we want to challenge mechanical foot stiffness. And as I mentioned, this is something that, it really is the origin of movement. So if we can't maintain that mechanically stiff foot, everything that we're getting up the chain is going to be compromised in some capacity. That, again, speaks to the kinetic sequencing, where we want to make sure that not only we're in the right position and we maintain the mechanically stiff foot, but we are appropriately sequencing the movement and putting it together in a coalesced fashion. Dynamically speaking, we see a lot of weakness with intrinsic foot muscles, the peroneal group or the lateral compartment of the lower leg, and lateral glutes, and isometrically the calves tend to be very weak. So if we take more of an isolated look at the foot and the ankle now, The foot and the ankle really is a magnificent design and display of architecture and biomechanics, but optimizing the foot and the ankle complex is much less about specific or specialized drills or exercises, but more so it's about appropriately cueing and positioning the foot and the ankle during standard conventional training. So, quite honestly, the best way to train the foot and the ankle specifically is to just remove the shoes for certain portions of your training. So, I've another one I've spoken a lot about, but barefoot warm-ups, low-level plyometrics without shoes, barefoot accessory work. I mean, that's going to predominate about 80% of the foot-specific stuff that I'm going to do, unless somebody has a specific injury or something that is glaringly weak or deficient, in which case we'll get into some more of the specific work, but really it's just that. And, the foot is a magnificent structure, so there's a lot going on, and it's something that we have to understand has a lot of independent segments to it. We may perceive the global outcome or the effects of movement and positioning, but really there are so many intricate parts to this that are coming together for these things to occur. I mean, I think the foot has about 26 muscles. There's like over 40 or 50 identifiable joints, all of the different fascial densities that we have at the foot. So in addition to that, we have the three segments of the foot where we're looking at the forefoot, the midfoot, and the hindfoot. And as I mentioned earlier, these are segments that are independently performing movements to create global outcomes. And a lot of this is based on reciprocating action of the foot. But if we look to kind of the general training principles or KPIs, I break these up into four predominant categories, those being force tolerance, compliance, intrinsic strength, and proprioception. And I'd be willing to bet that just about any athlete you see is going to be weak or deficient in at least one of these, if not more. For my population, I would say more often than not, athletes are pretty weak or pretty poor in about 2 or 3 out of the 4 in most cases. With force tolerance, and we have to understand forces experienced at the foot and the ankle are quite profound. Most research is now showing that the ankle joint during sprinting or high velocity, high impact movements is supporting about 9 to 13 times the amount of body weight. And with that, we double back again to talking about our mobility monsters. If you're just in there banging out dorsiflexion mobility and distraction drills all day, but you're not emphasizing or accounting for the stability piece, how do you anticipate the athlete to be able to manage or sustain that amount of force impact and being able to maintain integrity nonetheless? But while the ankle is about 9 to 13 times body weight, we can look to the Achilles too, and the Achilles is going to be about 5 to 7 times body weight during peak ground reaction forces. So just another example that the stiffness and the mechanical integrity of the foot and ankle complex is really going to be premier if we're talking about optimizing athletic function. Compliance, we're looking at the ability for the foot to bend and kind of shape, around a structure or surface, but also, again, maintaining the integrity of the foot. So when I think about compliance, I think about the contact area on the ground or the surface area of the ground. So for compliance, we want to generally try to have as much surface area as we can so we have more opportunity or room to disperse force. And this is going to directly influence our center of pressure and weight distribution. Also to mention, ability to resist deformation. We've spoken a bit about the intrinsic foot strength, but specifically here, intrinsic foot strength is speaking to the lumbricals of the foot, which line the bottom of the foot and kind of intersect the joints of the toes. And the lumbricals are going to help to AB and adduct the toes independently. So when we think about intrinsic foot strength, think about eccentric splaying of the foot and the toes. And again, covering a lot of surface area and being able to create kind of a wide foot. Intrinsic strength is also going to speak to our plantar flexor strength. So not plantar flexion, but the plantar aponeuroses and the plantar muscles of the foot that line the bottom of the foot, the ability to create active contraction. Something that I've seen a lot with my athletes is when you have them consciously contract the foot or squeeze the toes down into the ground, that grabbing cue, it will often incite a cramping or just kind of a mechanical overload for the foot just in isolation. Proprioception, another one we've spoken about pretty good now, but our sensory proficiency or our ability to detect ourselves in space. This is something that's going to rely heavily on motor control and kind of refined motor skill of the foot. And another thing with the proprioception is the vestibular component. When we're talking about vestibular components, we're thinking about the eyes, the ears, and the foot, and really our ability to orient in space and then maintain or execute a movement or provide stability. Looking at a couple of our specific deficits here, and just a quick sidebar, I guess kind of a self-promo here, but do recall that we've put out a product restorative foot series about a year ago, and I go into not only these three, but many others in pretty good detail in terms of addressing deficits. But to stick to these here today, chronic ankle sprains is something that we're going to see in just about any population, but chronic ankle sprains is much more than just a ligamentous and a muscular impairment or injury, where we are also going to have to work actively on the confidence factor, which is tied to the proprioceptive demand. And if we look at the anatomy of the ankle joint and kind of the dorsal surface of the foot, we notice that there is a strong sheath of ligamentous attachments, and in those ligaments we have an enriched embedding of proprioceptors. And the reason for this is when we look at proximity of joints, the more distal or the further away from the brain that the joint gets, the more embedded they are with proprioceptors. And that's because we need more sensory input to collect more information to send back, because it's a further distance from our governor of movement, which is the brain. So for ankle sprains, confidence, proprioceptive demand, dynamic stability, these are going to be kind of your bread and butter once foundational strength and lower leg strength has been reestablished. For plantar fasciitis and turf toe, I kind of lump these two together because of the proximity of anatomy, but also because I just have happened to notice that a lot of the restorative modalities that I use for each are pretty similar. But with plantar fasciitis, turf toe, make sure that you are addressing all of the time outside of the gym as much as you are emphasizing the work you're doing in the gym. With that, though, strengthening the intrinsic foot muscles, being able to eccentrically splay, distribute force. Fasciitis, tendonitis, all of these itises, really the gist of it is that is indication that you are improperly or incompletely distributing or transferring force, and it's changing the responsibility or the magnitude of contraction for the surrounding muscles or joints. So for these, we want to have a good balance of strength and soft tissue work. We want to make sure that we're getting the right treatments, not just doing the right strength stuff. Achilles rupture or tendonitis, this being the most severe of the three here, make sure for the strength and conditioning population that your athletes are cleared. They've been cleared by your athletic trainer, your physical therapist, the team doctor. If you work in the private sector, make sure that you have clear confirmation that you are good to go with the strength work, because I can assure you re-injuring an Achilles rupture is probably the last thing that you want to have on your resume. But with this, once we're cleared and good to go, we want to make sure that we're addressing eccentric loading. As we know with tendinous injuries, our tendons are where we are collectively accruing energy to be transferred from potential to mechanical working energy. And our ability to load eccentrically is going to govern the capacity of our ability to do so. Once we establish eccentric loading, we want to get into more of our low-level plyos and kind of actualizing the stretch shortening cycle. And then once we're clear there, then we'll get into more of our high force, high demand loading. So taking a look at some of the nuances of the foot and the ankle now, and we'll start out here just by kind of identifying some of the major anatomical landmarks at the foot and the ankle. So this is going to be a medial view of a right foot. So we have the big toe here, medial malleoli or ankle bone here, obviously the calcaneus being to the right side of the screen. But the most important thing to understand about the anatomy of the foot, which is quite vast, is that there are three segments of the foot that are constantly interacting and working together. So it's multiple segments that are collectively performing gross actions. So what we want to pay attention to more so than the kind of the nitty-gritty of the anatomy is how does the global action of the foot look? Are they able to segment and kind of disassociate each of the forefoot, midfoot, and hindfoot? If not, if we lose or have a reduction of mobility or movement in, say, the calcaneus, then the midfoot, the subtalis, and even just the kind of the entire tibiotalar or talocrural joint, the ankle joint, is going to have to work harder to achieve less. So when we see something like midfoot roll, or the common theme now is to pinpoint everybody with a flat arch, but flat arch in midfoot pronation is something that has to occur, especially during dynamic action such as sprinting. But the reason for this is the midfoot has to pronate or roll medially in order for the subtalar joint to be able to unlock so that the tibia can then dorsiflex over the foot. We need to create space in order to create movement. So when you see someone who has a midfoot roll or that navicular drop pattern, I just think that this is another one where it's very obvious when it's egregious. If it's not egregious, it's probably more productive than harmful. Going into more of the medial and the lateral groups now, the medial and the lateral compartments of the lower leg and the foot are going to be absolutely critical for success. I think this is the most commonly underappreciated area of the lower body, but we'll start on the outside here with the lateral group. We have our peroneals, which are going to be our predominant everters, which is pinky toe moving away from the body and the foot kind of coming off of the ground, and then assist in plantar flexion. The peroneal group also is where the peroneal nerve runs, and that is the primary nerve responsible for dorsiflexion, so a vital nerve for all athletes. Then we have the tibialis anterior, or the TA, which is going to be our primary dorsiflexor, and then assist in inversion. So you see two muscular structures running pretty much in parallel to one another, but due to the origin and insertion of these, actually performing reciprocating muscular action. So just kind of an interesting thing to know there. And then our ATFL, or our ligament that we commonly see sprained in what is known as the dreaded high ankle sprain. This is going to be a very prominent ligament and just one to monitor in terms of tensile strength and resiliency. On the medial side, we have our posterior tibialis. This is a kind of a lesser discussed muscle, but one of vital importance as well. And this is the muscle that's actually predominantly responsible for the pronation of the foot and kind of that adduction pattern of the midfoot. So this runs in parallel to the Achilles, and one that I think is commonly overlooked. We're going to have our deltoid ligaments on the medial side of the ankle bone. As we know, the entire joint is pretty much encapsulated with a dense amount of ligamentous structures, and so with this we have a very highly enriched proprioceptive network that kind of surrounds the ankle. So that's why, as we were mentioning on the ankle sprains, it's vital to improve the athlete's confidence before you start putting them under significant load. Rounding it out here, center of pressure at the foot is going to be important for pretty much anything that we're doing, but especially when we're getting into more dynamic actions, because again, the segmentation of the foot and the disassociation of each segment is going to be critical for force tolerance and ability to load in a dynamic fashion with good return on elastic energy. So we want to make sure that the shapes of the foot and the structures of the foot are not only doing what they're supposed to do, but they're being cued appropriately as well. So I normally start out with a base instruction of creating the tripod: big toe, ball joint of the big toe, pinky toe, and the heel. Pretty much evenly distributed pressure across those three. If we wanted to create more of a lateral bias, or somebody who may actually have too much midfoot pronation, we're going to drive through pinky toe predominantly, and then that's going to give us a little bit more of external rotation torque at the lower leg or the tibia, and this helps us to promote knee varus. Medial bias kind of being the opposite there, putting our pressure predominantly through the big toe joint, and then we can also kind of change muscular activation a little bit during, common accessory movements, RDL, lunge, etc., just by cueing the athlete to have more of a forefoot or having more of a hindfoot bias. I will say a hindfoot bias is something that I'm not going to do a ton of just because it's not a very natural thing, but in case when we need, hindfoot bias is going to give us more of a posterior chain focus. So now we'll take a closer look at the knees. We mentioned that the knee is ultimately the byproduct of the hip mobility and the foot stability, and I like to see the knees as the barometer of force tolerance. If we think about things in simplistic terms to get the point across, that's perfectly great, but we again need to understand that even though superficially the knee is a simplistic joint, there's a lot going on here. Looking at our KPIs or training principles here, I break the knee up into 4 categories of torque tolerance, impact tolerance, valgus varus, and dorsiflexion. So with torque tolerance, we already covered that the knee does not respond well to torque, and this, in the most simplest of fashions, is best represented by ACL tears. ACL tears are not a uniplanar or single joint action. They're not the consequence of that, rather. The conventional mechanism of ACL tears is hip internal rotation, tibial external rotation, midfoot pronation, generally also in a little bit of plantar flexion. But to the point, we get contrasting rotational forces at the femur and at the tibia under a plantar flexed foot that has midfoot bias. So that, for the ACL, is the recipe for disaster. If we don't have the foot stiffness or stability to maintain that heel position, and if we don't have the requisite hip mobility to accommodate that internal rotation torque, that is when the knee goes. So again, it's, we can do everything that we want, soft tissue wise, strength wise, mobility wise, at the knee itself. But if the constituent parts, the ankle, the foot, and the hip, are not adequately prepared, everything that we do for the knee is going to be in vain. The closed versus open chain conversation is something that isn't necessarily applicable in action, but I look at it in isolation just to kind of see if we can eliminate any variables. So if we have, for instance, strong open chain plantar flexion, or we have a strong tibialis anterior, but we can't closed chain dorsiflex, then that tells me that it's probably not the TA being weak, it's probably the talus not being able to move. So that changes the whole program, right? Or not the whole program, but for this case, where instead of doing, lower leg strengthening exercises, now we're going to work more on foot mobilization and being able to create enough space at the talus for the tibia to glide forward and then allow a decompression of stress on the ACL itself. But in the opposite case, if we were mobilizing the talus when it's the weak TA, then we are actually exacerbating what we have going on and the likelihood for injury. Impact tolerance is going to speak more to your cartilage population, your arthritic population, your itis population, but impact tolerance is going to be something that is either going to be repetition or magnitude based. So if we have repetition based, which honestly is probably the more common, at least in my experience, then we need to manage the volume very acutely. We need to understand where that tipping point is. If it's magnitude, then we know we need to just slow roll or progress a little bit more slowly before we start to implement anything that's higher impact or higher magnitude. I also think about, weight distribution and the loading and the landing position with things. Impact tolerance can be more or less improved just by cueing or coaching the right position, cueing or coaching, the right weight distribution or force distribution. As an easy example, if we think about something like a single leg hop or single leg bound, it's very common for athletes to want to kind of project that foot forward and then have more of a knee-based landing upon ground contact. But the cue that I'll use for that is to find the hip, right? So as we feel foot contact with the ground, we want to actively pull down into the hip as opposed to just letting the knee kind of hang out and take that force. Vectors are also a significant factor here, where if you have somebody who has a lateral meniscus or an LCL or MCL injury, you're more than likely going to have issues with lateral-based plyos or lateral-based movement, where they may be perfectly fine in sagittal. You change the vector on them, and then now we have some problems. So just something to be mindful of. I got a little bit ahead of myself on the varus and valgus conversation with our midfoot talk, but again, valgus is something that in isolation or in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's not necessarily wrong. It's not, again, an injury risk or a vulnerability. I mean, you watch just about any NBA player, and they're going to get knee valgus on their free throws, let alone on a dunk or on a fast break and changing direction. So I think that this is one where we have to see if the amount of movement and the way in which the movement is occurring in conjunction with what the rest of the body's doing and the athlete themselves are all considerable factors. Lastly, speaking to the dorsiflexion from the knees perspective here, really we just need to be able to displace the tibia. So if we don't have the ability to create eccentric lengthening on the patellar tendon or eccentric lengthening on the quad tendon, and that's prohibiting us from being able to glide forward in our dorsiflexion pattern, those are pretty easy to address and clean up. But if we don't have limitations there and we're still having trouble getting into good dorsiflexion pattern, then again, we go to the constituents above and below. Some of the common deficits at the knee, obviously ACL is one that everybody at some point or another should or will run into. But for me, I'm working with post-ACL well after conventional rehab and physical therapy have been completed. So again, like I mentioned on the Achilles tendon, the ACL is something that is very, very clear and cut and dry for early phase rehab. Make sure that all of your athletes have been signed off, PT, AT, doctor. But once they get to us as the strength coaches, really we want to start by just simply improving single leg strength. And we know about the quad wasting associated with the ACL. So when you start out with your athletes, make sure that you get a measure of the thigh right to left, and really try to work on reducing the amount of margin of difference between the operated and non-operated side. after we get past our foundational strength, then we're going to look at more of our heavy single leg variations, our low level plyos again, and then some dynamic and reactive stuff. ACL training isn't very specific, to be perfectly honest with you. I think it's just good foundational strength training and then adding the speed element to it. But this is kind of similar to the ankle sprains, where there's very much a confidence factor to this. So your job as the coach isn't to just give them the right tools and the right exercises and so forth, but it's also to reestablish that confidence and the ability to shut off the overthinking syndrome and just let athletes go be athletes. For cartilage injuries or for meniscus tears, we want to be very mindful of flexion. That's really going to be our big issue with the meniscus. So where with the ACL, our window of risk is going to be more in low flexion degrees, so 10 to 30 degrees of flexion. For meniscus, our danger zone is going to be deeper flexion. So it's really kind of 80, 90, and beyond. So kind of stair-stepping or baby stepping your way into deeper flexion. The transverse plane is going to speak more to reducing the amount of torque presence at the knee itself. The meniscus, I promise you, does not do well with torque. So kind of building our robustness from preventing the structure to have to accommodate torque is really my approach. We look last now at quad or patellar tendonitis or ITB or IT band syndrome. All of our itises, all of our syndromes in this context are just in disproportionate forces. So we want to look at our ratios of quad and hamstring strength. We want to look at our positional strength. What is the difference above and below 90 degrees? What is the differences between single leg and bilateral? And then from there, obviously, anything tendon based, we're going to start with introducing eccentric loading, working on tendon compliance, GTO desensitization, and then, again, our muscular co-contraction. So with the itises, with the patellar tendonitis, quad tendonitis, and ITB, really just trying to reacclimate or recalibrate the lower leg or the leg to appropriately balancing the strength and distribution of forces is really all it boils down to. And now for our nuances at the knee here, and we see with our anatomy picture in the center here, we've mentioned it a few times, but just because the knee appears to be a simplistic joint doesn't mean there aren't a lot of things going on here. So we can see here that beneath the surface, there's a lot of cross structures here. And, as we know, the ACL runs in kind of this X helical pattern here beneath the patella. And we can also look to like the tendon of the hamstrings, right? The hamstring tendons often have, almost like this braiding type of coiling pattern to them. And I think that that's just good indication that, we need to recognize the significance for non-sagittal movement that occurs at the knee. And then, of course, as we've emphasized quite heavily, the importance of torque resistance at the knee. But if we take a look over here at the ligament versus tendon injuries column, we know that the predominant injuries at the knee are going to be the ligament injuries, our ACL, PCL, MCL, LCL. And with this, the ligament injuries are almost a direct consequence of an excessive amount of torque in too short of a period of time for the body to be able to respond to. So with the ligamentous injuries, we know there's going to be very poor blood flow, which is why it takes so long for ligaments to heal completely, which in some cases can be upwards of over a year or up to 2 years. But our ligaments are going to be embedded with mechanoreceptors. These receptors are responsible predominantly for detecting and orienting position in space. So along with our mechanical loading and all of the structural conventional strengthening for ligamentous injuries, we also want to make sure we're accommodating for the mechanoreceptors as well. With tendinous injuries, predominantly speaking here, we're going to look at a quadriceps tendon injury or a patellar tendon injury. With each of these, we need to be very mindful of where we are loading, where we are applying load, and we'll get to that more in a second here. But the quad tendon is sometimes a consequence of an improper firing sequence of the quad muscles that kind of destabilizes that tendon because all four muscles of the quad intersect into one common tendon. So there's a lot of kind of input for one tendon bed. But on the inferior side, or our patellar tendon, what is commonly known as jumper's knee, this is typically due to just repetitive impact or repetitive force application at the same angles or the same ranges of motion. In addition, here we want to bear in mind that most ligament injuries are going to be of the acute nature. So I think of these more as absolute load injuries where we need to be mindful of the intensities in the training realm, where on the opposite end, tendons are going to typically be more of a chronic or a long-term type of development. Again, all of our itises and such. So for this, I'm usually more emphasized on monitoring the volume of our training as we go along. But now let's go ahead and segue into a quick video with Nicole demoing how load placement and body angles affect the knee joint. All right, so now to take a look at how joint angle and positioning and then how load positioning affect the outcome of movement. And to kind of start this out, I think it's important that we recognize that the type of squat pattern or the even where the load is placed is almost a secondary factor to how the movement is coached and how the body is positioned and how the joints are positioned as we go through the movement. That'll change the different firing patterns and emphasize or de-emphasize certain things. So the two predominant areas that we're going to look to here are the shin angle and then the trunk angle. And starting down with the shin angle, we can cue a squat to be either more knee over toe dominant or more vertical shin dominant. And for me personally, for bilateral stance especially, I kind of just see where the athlete is naturally. So if Nicole goes into her natural squat pattern, being an Olympic weightlifter, we see she's going to have a pretty sharp knee over toe pattern and a good amount of dorsiflexion down at end range. So for her, a bilateral squat position is going to be much more comfortable with a knee over toe pattern. If, for instance, she were the opposite, where it were more of a vertical or upright pattern, and go ahead and demo there, for her, this looks very awkward, obviously, and there's, a lot of discomfort in this position. So for her, more vertical shin position or preserved dorsiflexion would actually be more challenging. So this is just kind of a representation as to why it's important that we don't associate one or the other as good or bad necessarily. Now, if we speak to the knee joint specifically, if we have more dorsiflexion with our pattern, we're normally going to get more eccentric strain on the quad because we're going to be in deeper ranges of knee flexion. If we stay in more of a vertical or an upright position with the shins, we tend to see more strain on the patellar tendon as she's at end range here. Now, if we go to the trunk position is going to really predominate how much quad activation we have and how much posterior activation we have. So again, Nicole being an Olympic weightlifter, she's going to naturally favor trunk inclination. So this is going to give her a strong posterior chain dominance because there's longer levers back here. So she's getting more glute emphasis, a little bit more erector and paraspinal and lat emphasis. Go ahead and come on up. And if she were to have more of a vertical squat pattern, we see a more upright angle here. So there's less requirement on the posterior side to contribute here. All right, and coming down the stretch now, we'll take a look at the hips and the pelvis in more of an isolated view here. And as we mentioned, this is the primary transfer station or junction of the body. So for me, I think the more we can improve the hip and the pelvic girdle, the easier it is to really do work elsewhere. I'll start by saying this much. The further I get into this career, the less I rely on or perform bilateral movements. I know that this is a never-ending debate, and it's always going to depend on who you ask, but I look at the bilateral stance as our foundational strength. So we're going to use it with novice athletes. We're going to use it with athletes early out of rehab phases. And then, we're going to continue to sample bilateral strength movements throughout our periodization. But largely, in part, most of my work is going to come from split stance or single leg work. So two different split stance variations. We have general or generic split stance, which is where we have about a 60-40 split. 60% of our center of pressure is going to be in the front foot versus 40 in the back. And then a kickstand setup, which is something I've started to use more and more here recently, is going to be kind of a split between a split stance. So think like half of a split stance, and we're going to have more discrepancy between front and back foot, where about 80% of our center of pressure is going to be on the front foot, and then about 20% in the back leg. We've talked a lot about the floating heel, but I think that this is another one that is great for the hip as well. And for the hip, we're looking at obviously the hamstring, but then also kind of that ABA deduction control and tying that into our valgus varus control at the knee. But variable stances is something that I think is going to do a lot of the work for you with the hips specifically. When we get contrasting relationships at the hips, so for instance, in a split stance with one inflection, one in extension, neurologically, this is just familiar to the human body, and it's really, where most of our time is spent during sport or in life, really. So I just think that it makes more sense. But with single leg variations, we can delineate these between hinge and squat-based patterns. Hinge-based patterns obviously being eccentric lengthening of the hamstrings and working on really our triplanar stability of the hip. So with the hip stability, and we'll talk about this more in a second, we're always thinking triplanar. Everything is always going to be all planes of motion occurring at all times. And when we get into single leg patterning, hinging to be included, we are really managing the degree of rotation and the degree of freedom in all planes of motion. For our squat patterns, we look at something like a pistol versus a skater. Pistol squats, very bluntly, is something I'm very rarely, if ever, going to do. Just is something that is hardly, if ever, performed with proficiency. But we're going to be a little bit more hamstring glute dominant with a pistol versus a skater is going to be more quad glute dominant. And again, I think just based on the feasibility of movement for the athlete, pistols are something that have a pretty low return. If I do pistol squats, it's going to be to a fixed point, like to a box or to a bench, or I'm going to band assist it, where we're going to have the bands from coming down from overhead and help to load into the lower ranges of motion there. Step up and lunge patterning, so it's the same action with reciprocating muscular contraction. So with a step up, we're going to be a little bit more concentric driven, whereas with lunging, we're going to be a little bit more eccentric driven. Both lunging and step ups I like doing from a multitude of vectors. So a lateral step up, a lateral lunge, getting rotational work, doing like a crossover patterning for a step up or a curtsy patterning for a lunge. Just great options, I think, for just about anybody. And then, of course, our lateral or our transverse variations are going to be apparent as well. For the rotational piece, we need to understand that there's going to be a difference between having rotation with a fixed femur and pelvic rotation, and then having a fixed pelvis with femur rotation. Each is going to have its own benefits, but generally speaking, a fixed femur with pelvic rotation is going to be a natural rotation pattern. So in most cases, we have our foot in contact with the ground, the femur is fixed, and then the torso and the pelvis rotate over top of the fixed femur. That is a natural sport action. If we go the opposite way and we have a fixed pelvis with a femur or a femoral rotation, this is something that would need to be structured more in a drill sense. So a supine banded hip internal rotation being a good example of this. I look at the fixed pelvis with femur rotation as a way of localized strengthening for the smaller porting muscles that are involved in more gross or global rotational patterns. Speaking of which, the global rotation, so where we have both femoral and pelvic rotation, this is where we go back to our coiling cue, where we're trying to get everything to be synergistic in our motion. For the mobilities piece, internal external rotation is by far for me the one that is most efficient with my athletes. I think that internal and external rotation are mostly important because those are the synergistic motions to flexion and extension. So as we go into flexion, we have concurrent internal rotation, and as we go into extension, we have concurrent external rotation. So making sure that we are addressing those so that we have good flexion and extension patterns more so than anything else. ABA deduction, those are going to speak more for themselves, but the mobility piece there is going to be like your half-kneeling adductor rocks, or another good one is like your 90-90 drops, and then getting into more of your lateral lunging with rocking patterns. Those are all pretty easy to address and clean up. We again have a delineation between pelvic and femoral movement, but with all of that being said, as we've addressed, meet the demands of the sport, no more, no less. So if you have a catcher in baseball or softball, they're obviously going to have a much higher mobility demand than if you have your outfielders. So no need to apply mobility where it isn't needed for your athletic populations. Common deficits here: weak internal rotation and adduction. The adductors, again, are a very critical piece of the puzzle here. So make sure that you have some type of assessment, whether it's a manual strength test or whether it's just looking at your ability to create movement from the adductors, or if it's even just eccentric control of a gait or a sprint action. Have something that is going to address or assess rather the adductors, and make sure that you are implementing that into your training plan. The caveat: when we're doing anything on one leg, we're working adductors, we're working the internal rotators. Improving hip flexion is going to indirectly help address this area as well, but isolate to integrate is my key. We've already talked about varying the stance, working out of the split stance, kickstands, single leg. That's going to be great for the adductor-abductor relationship. And then, again, isolating to integrating. So making sure that independently and in isolated fashion, the adductors are proficiently strong, but then we build that into a bigger recipe. We've talked a lot about the tight hip flexor conversation, but again, just because something has this sensation of feeling tight does not mean that that is only to be treated with flexibility work. There is a strength component that complements it. So I look to strengthen the flexors and then soft tissue the quad, because where the flexors are weak, the quads tend to be overly dominant and need to almost be kind of toned down to give the flexors an opportunity to do their job. Labrum tears, FAI, hip impingement, bursitis, again, kind of our itis group here. Big thing here is just a strong continuity or congruency between the joint interface. So a strong femoral acetabulum connection, keeping the ball on the tee or keeping the joint in the socket, and then increasing our ability to produce rotary movement from both a localized and a global fashion are going to be really our main work here. So this is one where there really isn't a lot of specificity to it. It's just going to be a default byproduct of good programming and good exercise selection. For our nuances, the first one I wanted to address here is our kinetic force transfer. So if we break this up into vertical, rotational, and horizontal based movements, we have some major cueing or some major sequencing that we want to see. So for the vertical movements, we want to make sure that we are finishing aggressively through hip and knee extension with the vertical torso stacked on top of the pelvis. The more we deviate front to back or left to right with vertical based movement, the more we have to overcome to achieve less. So the positioning here is really going to be key above and below the joint, and then the actions are going to take care of themselves if we get the athletes in the right positions. As for rotational movement, this is something that's going to be a lot more dependent on A, context of sport, B, the situational strength or ability of the athlete, but largely in part, I want to initiate this through a rapid snapping of the hip and the leg into internal rotation as we're going into full terminal extension and then finishing through the foot. So this is where I'll utilize that stabbing cue for the foot to help drive the snapping of the hip. Horizontal movement is going to be, again, an aggressive extension, but we're going to finish by pulling down actively through the hamstrings upon ground contact. So with horizontal based movement, I don't think that there's as much of a difficulty with the production of movement as much as there is the landing or the acceptance of movement. So making sure that we're getting them to pull down actively through the hamstrings is key there. Counter rotation is something I see quite a bit. I don't think that this is something that's very prominent in the athletic realm, but with counter rotation, we're basically looking at one hip that is anteverted, anterior tilted, and internally rotated with the reciprocal pattern on the opposite hip. So if we look at this visually, we're seeing a forward shift of the hip. So we have kind of a shift in the torso that follows. And then if we look on more of a micro scale, the anteversion of the one hip is going to create retroversion of the other hip. So now we're getting almost a unilateral displacement or hiking of one of the hips. And with this, there's obviously going to be sweeping effects above and below, but counter rotation is best cleaned up by just isolating each hip. So again, getting out of bilateral, doing things with more unilateral or split dominance with all of our movements is going to address a lot of this. But the psoas and the QL relationship is going to be an important one. So, if we have the anteverted hip or the hip that's kind of shifted forward, that's going to create more of a fibrotic and tight psoas on the one side, but then on the contralateral QL on the posterior side, we're going to get that same problem. So we want to address those concurrently as opposed to one at a time, because then we're going to really start to delay our complete takeaways. We want to make sure that everything is being addressed independently first and then collectively second, but addressing things concurrently is key here. The trunk muscles and the spine function are going to be empirically important for this. Again, because of the intersection of the SI and the lumbosacral junction, our spine is going to respond to the positioning of the pelvis accordingly. So making sure that we are both cueing and applying the correct exercise selections and programming points is going to be key there. Triplanar stability, we definitely have hit on this one, but broadly speaking, a reduction in single leg stability can be tied to the loss of internal rotation or just lateral glute strength. So again, we go back to our micro muscles, the glute med, glute min, making sure that we are able to position and stabilize through the glute rather than through the knee is going to be important here. But knowing that the motion is occurring in all degrees of freedom at all times is really a premier point to this. So consider where you're loading, how you're loading, and then where you're seeing the deficits or the weaknesses to kind of assess and progress correctly. All right, so that about wraps up everything that I had for you all today on the webinar side. However, I did want to mention I did something a little bit different with this one. I put together just a little microdose type of program, a little 4-week sample here that basically puts together or puts in sequence everything that was discussed throughout the webinar here. So this will be provided through our website, so please check out the link in the caption below here. But this is a purely lower body program, 4 days a week, 4 weeks, and I think this is something that's great for anybody who is either coming off of a specific lower body injury and or is specifically trying to improve lower body strength. So make sure you check that out. All videos are hyperlinked. There's some other resources that we put in there, so kind of a little bit of a bonus package, so to speak, here. Thank you guys so much for tuning into these. I really do appreciate your time, and carving out parts of your week to listen to me really does mean a lot to me, so I'm sincerely grateful for that. If you guys didn't catch them, we do have 2 other webinar episodes currently up right now that we've released within the last month here, part of this little running 2021 webinar series. But offset training, restorative strength training for tactical athletes, 2 topics that I'm both very passionate about, and so far I've been getting some good views and some feedback from. So do check those out in case you've missed them. And I'll have one more coming up for you here soon. I'm narrowing it down to 1 or 2 topics now. So after we get this one up and running, we'll have one more out, and that will complete our series. But make sure while you guys are there to please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's been growing great here in the last couple months. And again, we really appreciate all of you, but do spread the good word, and please make sure that you subscribe while you're there. And last but not least, couldn't leave you without a couple of pictures of some beautiful young men here. But shout out to my guys, Rudy, Rocky, and then little Strauss over here, who's coming along quite nicely. But all of our social media handles are right here, and please remember, I'm just 1/3 of the operation that is Rude Rock Strength. Be sure to check out my lovely wife, Nicole, and Jeremy as well, 2 brilliant minds who are great with what they do. And as always, if you guys have any questions on any of this or otherwise, you're always more than welcome to please reach out to me directly, and I'm always here to help when I can. Thank you.